Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to talk about Chapter 28, Part 3, Long-Term and Short-Term Consequences of the Atlantic Revolutions Around the World. So by the end of this presentation, you should be able to answer the two following questions. How did the Atlantic Revolutions and their ideas influence later state development globally, specifically in the form of nationalism and anti-colonialism? And how did the Atlantic Revolutions influence the political and economic situations in their specific locations? So let's start with perhaps the most well-known and immediate consequence of some of these Atlantic revolutions, and that would be the rise of a man named Napoleon Bonaparte and the aforementioned Age of Napoleon, which is set to date from 1799 to 1815. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte was a young Corsican military man who saved the post-National Assembly government of France called the Directory from a attempted military coup, and then went on to seize power himself in a military coup. He is famous for having officially declared the French Revolution to be over. And even though he went back and brought France full circle with an absolute ruler, nonetheless was very popular with the French people for his military prowess and string of victories that allowed him to defeat his rivals across Europe. One of the reasons that Napoleon was able to defeat his enemies was that he had invoked a concept from the revolution called Levee en masse, which was used to rapidly gain new recruits for the French army. Napoleon is also known for his effective use of artillery, his ability to organize logistics, as well as some of his new tactical maneuvers using cavalry and infantry. He is widely considered to be one of the better generals in military history, but if you'd like to learn more about that, there's plenty of YouTube channels out there that can tell you all about it in much more detail. For our interest, for our sake, the most important thing we're talking about is Napoleon and the ideas of the French Revolution. When you build a cross-continental European empire, it gives you the opportunity to spread some of those ideas, and that's what Napoleon did. He took many of the ideas of the revolution and he spread them across Europe in a way they might not have been able to without these military conquests. So, for example, many of the new states that he reorganized or occupied included giving them constitutions that they had not previously had before. In addition, he created a law code known as the Code Napoleon, which instituted many of the revolutionary reorganizations and ideas. And this law code became the basis for most law codes across Europe until the early 20th century. Now, it's worth noting that this included many things such as limited government and property protection, although it did go back on some of the more revolutionary ideas, which included property rights that had been granted to women in the highest point of the revolution. Additionally, his wars of conquest implemented some of the economic reforms that had been seen in the French Revolution, such as the destruction of the guild system, the weakening or elimination of serfdom, and created a system of limited free trade. It would not be fair to say there was free trade across the continent of Europe, but within some of these reorganized states, the elimination of tolls or other barriers to trade was seen. Additionally, this distributed the idea of nationalism, that is, the idea that the state gains its power from the people. And in this case, this kind of meant cultural and linguistically similar areas that had been previously disunited, such as Germany and Italy. But in addition to sort of explicitly spreading nationalism, resisting the French conquest, as many people in Germany and Russia, parts of Spain and parts of Italy did, would create national myths and celebrations that would help solidify later nations. And so Napoleon's age is definitely an effect of the revolution, in addition to a cause of additional revolutions such as the Latin American revolutions, and it did play a role in the Haitian Revolution. But for our sake, the spreading of French revolutionary ideas is one of the lasting contributions of Napoleon to history. Another more immediate consequence of the Age of Revolutions would be the follow-up, something known as the Spring of Nations, which comes after the Age of Napoleon. Once Napoleon is defeated, the victorious European powers meet in Vienna, which is the capital of Austria, and they try to sort of restore the old order, something called the Congress of Vienna. Congress being an alliance, not necessarily a meeting of people. The idea being that they're going to bring back all the old kings, put back most of the old borders, and restore the balance of power that existed before the rise of France and the French Revolution. And for about 20 years, this does seem to work with a few small hitches, but in 1848, the rising tide of industrialization, urbanization, increasing literacy, and the spread of those national ideas boils over into what is sometimes known as the Spring of Nations, a movement of working class individuals, intellectuals, the middle class, to sort of come together and create new, more democratic societies. Now, this only lasted a year. It's sometimes called the Spring of Nations because it occurred through the spring, summer, and fall of 1848. And in most of these revolutions resulted in sort of military suppression. It was not successful. But the people, again, they reflected a lot of those classic demands of the Atlantic Revolution, such as a limited government, freedom of the press, an end to aristocracy, sometimes an end to serfdom, and a new one, national unification of divided people. Now, of course, that would also be a really big question of who gets to be unified into what country? If you have a place where it's 50% one ethnic group, cultural group, and 50% of different ethnic group, cultural group, whose nation does that territory get to belong to? This would become a big question going forward. In Great Britain, there was political reformers, something called the Chartist movement, which demanded an expansion to the very limited suffrage. And eventually, that did happen. The Reform Act of 1876 would give most people in Great Britain the right to vote. In Ireland, there were some disturbances against English landlords. It's worth noting that sometimes a revolution is against good old-fashioned land despotism. Efforts to unify these peoples into a single nation, both of which failed due to being suppressed by aristocratic and military forces. But in France, there was an interesting development where the final king, Louis Philippe of the House of Orleans, was removed, and the Second French Republic was established. That would be the second out of 5 French republics, so we'll see what happens after that. One more immediate sort of short-term consequence of the Atlantic revolutions would be the laying of the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Enlightenment had many thinkers who traditionally opposed economic monopolies or government control of economic life. Adam Smith was famous as an advocate of free trade and rational organization of labor, and those ideas will eventually play a part in the Industrial Revolution, but Napoleon's wars across Europe also played a role in transforming Europe economically and again setting the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution. So his reorganization of existing states also reorganized existing networks of economic exchange, and in some cases broke down old trade barriers. For example, Napoleon reorganized many of the German states into a single confederation. This would be maintained after his removal from power. Within this confederation, all interstate tolls and taxes were removed, and this would serve as the inspiration for a customs union that would come after Napoleon's fall, known as the Zollverein, which would help unify Germans economically while they were being unified politically as well. In addition, Great Britain itself, which is where the Industrial Revolution would have its birth, was fundamentally transformed by its long multi-decade war against Napoleon and against the American colonists. The loss of over 500,000 men in combat would indeed push for the creation of labor-saving devices, the rise of banking establishments to loan the government money to help fight Napoleon, including the famous Rothschild family bank, as well as the increase in agricultural output needed to feed the armies fighting the wars against Napoleon and the Americans. All of this would lay the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution to follow. So one of the fundamental immediate consequences of the Atlantic revolutions was setting the stage for the Industrial Revolution. Looking a little bit further ahead in terms of long-term consequences, one of the interesting legacies of the revolutionary era was the rise of ideologies that are somewhat familiar to us today. And these ideologies formed themselves in how they reacted to the revolutions. And so one of these is called conservatism, which fundamentally rejected many of the notions of the age of revolution. And one of their kind of mottos was revolution, not evolution. And these individuals could mostly be found in England, which had managed to escape a lot of the revolutionary fervor. Conservatives tended to believe that the church was good and that monarchy was also good, provided that the monarchs were competent, and that if any change was to happen at all, it should be rather slow. Most famously, English politician Edmund Burke had hated the French Revolution and spoke out against it as basically a destruction of all civilization. Although, interestingly enough, he was okay with the American Revolution because he believed that the protection of property rights justified the American Revolution against Great Britain. On the other hand, you have an idea known as liberalism, which tended to approve of the age of revolutions and its concern with civil rights, protection of the individual, limited government, economic freedom, tended to favor constitutional monarchs or in some cases republics. One of the famous promoters of liberalism was the English philosopher John Stuart Mill, who talked about individual freedom as the basis for a limited government. So constitutions to restrain monarchs, republics to restrain the masses. This was the best way to promote individual freedom. And this could be a key cornerstone of politics until the 20th century. Now, we today, I should note a couple of things. We today associate liberalism with the use of government power and influence to improve life. This development would not come around until the mid-1900s. And so this is the initial, what sometimes is called on the internet, classical liberalism. Also, it's worth noting that the term socialist and all of its connotations and all of what it means was chosen to be a direct counter 2, the concept of liberalism's individualism. One additional long-term consequence that I've talked about several times was the concept of nationalism becoming popular. And this concept of nationalism as the basis for organizing a state or a government led to something known as the nation state. And that is that the nation, as a functioning government entity, a territory, should be centered around a group of people that share a same language, history, religion, culture. All these things together constitute the nation. Now, this is in contrast to what we have seen traditionally as the empire, whereas you might have had multiple ethnic groups with many different histories, languages, and religions, but they all had loyalty to the ruler or the concept of the empire itself. One of the sort of side effects of nationalism would be the rise in educational institutions. If you've ever wondered why in school you're required to pledge allegiance to the flag or learn exactly where the United States' borders are or the history of the United States, that is in part because the educational systems are used to reinforce that sense of identity. On a political level, this sense of nationalism, this desire for a nation state would lead to a number of movements as well as rebellions and insurrections across Europe in places such as Germany, Italy, Poland against the Russian Empire, Serbia against the Ottoman Empire. Germany is probably the most famous one, so I'm going to talk about that for a second. But after the age of Napoleon, Germans began to see themselves as belonging to a common homeland, sometimes called a Vaterland. In addition to resisting Napoleon, as I mentioned earlier, throughout the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, a number of Germans began to adapt cultural institutions and traditions and form the concept of a united German people. So, for example, the Brothers Grimm collected a number of fairy tales that you probably read as a child, and historical figures, even those who were not alive at the time, such as Johann Goethe and Martin Luther, became symbols, if you will, of the new German nation. In other words, it was fundamentally German to be part of Martin Luther's Protestant church. Of course, this is retroactive assigning of an identity, and it's always very interesting to think about what Martin Luther himself might have said about a German nation. Nationalism has an interesting connection with the ideas of the Enlightenment. In some respects, nationalism grows out of the Enlightenment and has its base in the Enlightenment. It doesn't necessarily mean that nationalism achieved through Enlightenment ideas. For example, Germany is not unified by the Frankfurt Parliament in the Revolution of 1848. Germany is unified under a military government by Otto von Bismarck, who's known as the Iron and Blood Chancellor because he waged 4 different wars to unify Germany into one state. It's also worth noting that nationalism threatened traditional empires such as the Austrian Empire or the Ottoman Empire. So how do you deal with that? How do you counter the growing threat of nationalism? Well, if you're the Ottoman Empire, you try your own form of nationalism, sort of an imperial nationalism. This is known as Ottomanism that we'll talk a little bit about when we get to chapter 31. If you're Austria, you make peace with the second largest national group within your empire and give it a share in the political process. And that is where we get the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria-Hungary Empire in 1867. That was the Austrians striking a bargain with the Hungarians and saying, look, the two of us can run the empire. Of course, nationalism is most heavily associated with Europe, but it's not only found in Europe. And across the world during this time, there's a number of different movements that could arguably be called nationalism, such as the push for native learning in Japan. That is the unconnecting of Buddhism and Shintoism in Japan. The Maori King movement, which was an effort to resist British land purchases in New Zealand by having the Maoris come together and elect a king of all the Maori people. There was also Tecumseh and the Pan-Indian movement in the United States in the 1830s, which sought to unite all of the Indian tribes against an increasingly powerful United States. In France in the 1890s, there was an event known as the Dreyfus Affair, in which a Jewish military officer was accused of espionage and disloyalty to France. The bitterness of the entire Dreyfus Affair and the anti-Jewish vitriol that it brought out in France convinced a young Jewish reporter named Theodor Herzl of the need for Jews to have their own homeland. This is known as Zionism, or perhaps Jewish nationalism. This is one of the most critical influences of the Age of Revolution is probably just the fact that it served as an inspiration for so much history going forward. So, for example, today, the world we live in, secularism, popular sovereignty, limited representative government is the norm. This is what most governments are, at least officially. Of the 190 some odd countries, only 6 don't make any sort of claim to democracy at all. Even countries that we would consider totalitarian dictatorships at least claim in some way, shape, or form to be democratic. inspiration in the short term between then and now. So, for example, the final end of legal slavery, although Haiti did it on their own, in the United States in particular, many anti-slavery advocates would wrap themselves in the cloak of the United States Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. In an effort to make their case against these institutions, they would make allusions and callbacks to the original ideas of these revolutions. And the Declaration of Sentiments, which was a women's suffrage movement declaration, mirrored the Declaration of Independence right into the 20th century. Decolonization movements across Africa, Asia, and parts of the Pacific, when calling for an end to European rule over their countries in the mid-20th century, would often allude to the ideas put forth in these Atlantic revolutions. After World War II, the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights also borrows a lot from the documents produced during the Atlantic revolutions. Finally, the Atlantic revolutions have a direct inspiration, at least in part, almost every major future political revolution that would come in the 20th century. Now, some of you might look at this list of revolutions that's on the screen here and say, well, I know for a fact that X revolution didn't end up in democracy, and it's now this country is a dictatorship or whatever. And that's perfectly fine. You could make that case. But whatever happened after the revolution doesn't change what inspired the revolution. But anyhow, I want to thank you for joining me. So you should be able to answer those two questions from the beginning of the presentation. My name is Mr. Little, and I will see you next time. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video was able to help you. If you appreciate this kind of work, please like and subscribe. And of course, I welcome any kind of feedback or suggestions, so feel free to leave a comment down below. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.